The Committee on House Administration will come to order. I note that a quorum is present. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare a recess at any time. Before we begin, I'd like to recognize one of our colleagues is not here today, Dr. Murphy. This week he announced that he was diagnosed with a base of skull tumor. All of us on this committee know that Dr. Murphy is a fighter. And I think I speak for everyone when I say we're all keeping Dr. Murphy in our thoughts and prayers. We wish him a speedy recovery and are looking forward to him being back on this dais with us again soon. Knowing Dr. Murphy, I'm guessing he's probably watching the live feed from home, and so if you are Dr. Murphy, we look forward to having you back. Today, we will consider legislation to stop foreign influence in our elections, prevent non-citizens voting, and strengthen our election administration. Over the past several months, this committee has examined different pieces of legislation that would increase confidence in our elections. When Americans are more confident in that their elections are secure, they're more likely to participate. As chairman of the committee, my focus has been on increasing confidence in participation in our elections. Last week, we held a hearing focused on non-citizen voting and foreign influence in our elections. Witnesses discussed the difficulties the National Voter Registration Act can place on states and the challenges states have at maintaining clean voter rolls. We've also demonstrated how foreign nationals are trying to influence our elections here in the United States. Federal law prohibits foreign nationals from contributing to campaigns, yet we continue to see foreign nationals use loopholes to get around this. We'll consider legislation today to address this issue. My legislation, the Preventing Foreign Interference in American Elections Act, would close the loophole and strengthen donor privacy protections. We'll also consider legislation to help states clean their voter rolls and prevent non-citizens from voting. Non-citizen voting in our elections must be stopped. You may hear my colleagues on the left say, non-citizen voting in federal elections is already illegal. But as we discussed in last week's hearing, there have been non-citizens registered to vote in Ohio, in Virginia, in Pennsylvania. Here in our nation's capital, the D.C. City Council passed legislations to allow non-citizens to vote in municipal elections, and non-citizens will be voting this fall. The D.C. Board of Elections recently confirmed that nearly 500 non-citizens have registered to vote in our nation's capital, and that number is only growing. Early voting for D.C.'s primary election is happening right now. And as we sit here today, non-citizens are voting to elect members of the D.C. City Council. That's absurd. We must do two things. One, we cannot allow D.C. citizens vote, the D.C. citizens voting law to spread across the United States. And two, we need to ensure non-citizens aren't voting in federal elections across the United States. While it's illegal today for non-citizens to vote in our federal elections, it's also illegal to evade Border Patrol and unlawfully enter the country. And as we've seen, that hasn't stopped anyone. We must end non-citizen voting now. It's critical that we provide states the tools they need to verify citizenship for individuals registering to vote. As we discussed last week in this committee, it's difficult for states to maintain clean voter rolls. Last week, we found in Ohio 137 non-citizens were on the voter rolls. In May of 2023, Virginia removed 1,481 non-citizens from their voter rolls. Across the country, Democrat jurisdictions are allowing non-citizens to vote in their elections. This will continue to create challenges for states to maintain clean voter rolls unless we stop non-citizen voting. The Constitution and federal law only protects the rights of citizens of the United States to vote in U.S. elections. That's why only U.S. citizens should be voting in U.S. elections. I look forward to a thoughtful discussion on the legislation before us today, and I yield back. I'll now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Morelli, for 5 minutes for the purpose of offering his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and first and most importantly, let me join with you in wishing our friend and colleague, Dr. Murphy, a full and speedy recovery, and we're keeping him very much and his family very much in our prayers, so the best to him. As it relates to the hearing that we held last week, which in my view was not only a waste of this committee's time, but a waste of the taxpayer resources that this committee has expended to disseminate the disproven lies to actively undermine American faith in our democracy. And I appreciate my colleague who talks about confidence in American elections and the importance of Americans having confidence. Unfortunately, everything this committee has sought to do, everything the former president seeks to do, is undermine that very faith. I know that every one of my majority colleagues understands that this narrative will aggravate the perilous infection of election denialism that is spreading in the American civic body, and the rest of us know it too. Just a point about last week's hearing. The Associated Press, in an article that ran in the Wisconsin State Journal this past Tuesday, said, and I quote, "Republicans who have been vocal about voting by those who are not citizens have demurred when asked for evidence that it's a problem." USA Today, one of the largest circulations in the country, so many Americans are reading USA Today, said that the SAVE Act is the same, quote, rigged election disinformation that Trump has been hawking for almost 8 years. The Washington Post said that Republicans, quote, feel compelled to construct a boogeyman to toe Trump's line on combating voter fraud, even as they freely acknowledge they can't say what the boogeyman is made of, end quote. The deluge of articles published in the last 2 weeks alone shows what a transparent game people are playing. The American people see through this as well. Election denialism was unpopular in 2020. It was equally unpopular, if not more so, in 2022. It will be unpopular this November. Just as the Speaker's trip, paying homage at Mar-a-Lago, tarnished our American tradition of democracy, just as the Speaker's conspiracy-fueled press conference on the steps of this Capitol fanned the flames of extremism, and just as our hearing energized efforts to undermine American confidence in elections, this markup today is the latest blemish on the majority's anti-democracy quest. We've been here before. Former President Trump is leading this party, in strikingly leading this very committee down a terribly dangerous and un-American path. This is a man who yearns for, according to his own campaign materials, a unified Reich in this country. This is the man you have changed your electoral prospects, to say nothing of your moral leadership and historic legacies to. Aren't you embarrassed? I, for one, am embarrassed for you. Today's markup of the SAVE Act is a repugnant use of our time. Committee Democrats have grave concern about each of the bills, and we will offer several amendments in an effort to make these bills better, or at the very least, to offer Americans an alternative vision of democracy, one based in fairness, in justice, not based on fear, cynicism, and doubt. Our vision of democracy is based on a Constitution that has moved ever forward from our founding, expanding its wings of equality and enfranchisement to informally enslaved people, to women, to Native people, to young people. That's the story of this nation, one of a democracy that grows more inclusive, that ensures that the voices of every American can be heard by those of us who have been entrusted to walk the halls of Congress. The SAVE Act is the opposite of that. It is contrary to the American story that has been told for 247 years, and God willing, will be told for countless years to come. This is the fundamental difference between our parties today. And the Democrats on this committee will not stop fighting for the rule of law, for the peaceful transfer of power, and for the very survival of this republic. And what committee Democrats won't do is subvert American faith in elections in an effort to supplicate to a proven con man. We'll leave that to our Republican colleagues. That I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Without objection, the opening statement of all other members will be included in the record. As required by House rules, a substantive copy of the measures to be considered today have been made available to members and the public at least 24 hours in advance. I now call up H.R. 8399, the Preventing Foreign Interference in American Elections Act. As I mentioned in my opening remarks, this legislation would close the loopholes foreign nationals can use to donate to campaigns. Today, under current law, foreign nationals can pay for activities like voter registration, ballot harvesting, and get-out-the-vote activities. In recent years, we've seen the impact that Zuckerbucks have had in reducing confidence in elections administration. Our hearing last week demonstrated that foreign nationals are using nonprofits as a pass-through to contribute to campaigns, often Democratic super PACs. When we had the Federal Elections Commission before our committee, both Democrat and Republican commissioners agreed that we must close this loophole. Congress must close the loophole. We must pass this bill in order to do so. I'll now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Morelli, if he'd like to give a statement on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, I would. I fervently believe Congress has a duty to stem the tide of foreign money in our elections. For this reason, I've been proud to advocate for the passage of the Freedom to Vote Act, which contains several provisions aimed at stemming this tide, including the Disclose Act and the Honest Ads Act. I was also happy to support the majority's efforts last Congress to advance a bipartisan recommendation of the FEC related to foreign money and ballot initiatives. This bill seems incongruous, however, with that critical duty. This bill does absolutely nothing to get foreign money out of our politics. On the one hand, the measure suggests it's important to ensure that foreign money does not influence American elections. Fine. On the other hand, however, several provisions of this bill make it more likely that foreign donors would be able to fund election activities in the United States by hampering disclosure and the FEC's law enforcement capacity. We know this to be true. Americans are frustrated by a campaign finance system that seems to be stacked in favor of special interests and dark money donors. We know that robust transparency is the best way to reassure the American people that their political system works for them. As Justice Louis Brandeis famously stated, sunlight is the best disinfectant. So why in the world would this committee's majority propose legislation that undermines transparency, inviting even more undisclosed, dark, likely foreign money to infiltrate our political system, as this bill, as drafted, would do? Why in the world would the majority hamstring law enforcement's ability to ensure the rule of law, to see to it that our federal campaign finance laws are fairly enforced, as this bill, as drafted, would do? If there are drafting errors, and I hope there are, I'd ask the chair to reconsider bringing this bill to a vote today. I recognize the bill includes some exemptions for the donor shielding provisions. The exceptions, however, do not salvage the bill. Instead, they gloss over systemic issues that need to be solved. In 2017, the Trump administration reversed a years-long rule requiring certain 501c organizations to report major donors to the IRS. Since then, the dark money ecosystem has hobbled the IRS. Moreover, millions in dark money goes unreported to the FEC due to loopholes unsolved by this measure. Finally, a dysfunctional FEC has ceased all meaningful enforcement of existing laws. Indeed, the FEC has informed this committee that it had acted on barely half of the nonpartisan staff's recommended foreign interference investigations, including none that involved Mr. Trump's, his campaign, or his associates. In matters requiring dark money groups to register and report with the FEC acted on only 5 of nonpartisan career staff's 24 recommendations. I want to be clear. I'd be eager to work in tandem with you to find common ground and common accord to fulfill our important duty. And I would be happy to work with you to find bipartisan consensus here. In that vein, I will propose several amendments today to ensure that we're able to comprehensively stop foreign money infiltrating our elections. I hope my colleagues join me in supporting them. If, however, the bill is designed to further open the floodgates to undisclosed foreign donations, to kneecap the FEC and other law enforcement agencies, then we will strenuously oppose. So, Mr. Chair, you can tell me whether we work together to limit foreign money or whether the majority intentionally drafted this measure in such a way to make it even easier for foreign donors to hide the sources of their contribution. And with that, I'll yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The clerk will please report the bill.
H.R. 8399.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. Also without objection, the bill shall be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. I have an amendment in the nature of a substitute at the desk. The clerk will please report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a
Without
substitute.
objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute is considered as read and will be considered as original text for the purpose of further amendment. The question now occurs on adopting the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye.
You're just doing the amendment, yeah.
I'm sorry,
Just adopting the aims.
no, to use it as base text.
Correct, yeah, that's what I understood. Yep.
Yep, so considered as original text for purpose of further amendment. The question now occurs on adopting the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the aims is now considered as original text for purposes of further amendment.
I have an amendment.
The gentleman has an amendment at the desk. The clerk will please report.
proceed to use the ANS as base text. Then you adopt ANS, then you would take the bill. But, okay.
Yeah. Yes.
The clerk will please report the amendment.
Amendment.
Without objection, further reading of the amendment will be dispensed with.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order.
Gentlewoman from Florida reserves a point of order. Mr. Morelli is recognized for 5 minutes in support of the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment, which is the Disclose Act, is about making sure that the American people have transparency around the foreign and big money spenders that have such a significant impact on our electoral system. Voters should be able to follow the money. Critically, Congress should close loopholes allowing spending by foreign nationals in domestic elections. For example, in 2021, the Federal Election Commission, the independent federal agency charged with protecting the integrity of the federal campaign finance process, found reason to believe and conciliated a matter where an experienced political consultant knowingly and willfully violated federal law. The consultant had solicited a contribution from a foreign national by offering to transmit a $2 million contribution to a super PAC through his company and 2 501c4 organizations to conceal the origin of the funds. This scheme was only unveiled after a news article reported the solicitation. The same political consultant was later convicted of a near-identical scheme involving a Russian national. Congress must do more to stem the tide of foreign money seeking to influence our elections. The Disclose Act clarifies the scope of the foreign nationals ban and incorporates the bipartisan FEC recommendation to capture ballot initiatives, among other reforms. The Disclose Act also addresses the problem of money that is laundered through various front groups or shell entities to hide the original source of campaign-related spending. The Supreme Court has repeatedly endorsed disclosure because it helps voters hold elected leaders accountable. So this is a common-sense amendment that would increase transparency in American democracy and stop foreign interference, something that should have bipartisan support, and I urge my colleagues to support this amendment. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. Does any other member seek recognition? The question is on the amendment. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chairs, the noes have it.
Mr. Chair, would I'd ask for a recorded vote?
A recorded vote has been requested. A roll call vote is requested. The clerk will please call the roll.
Chairman Stile?
No.
Chairman Stile votes no. Mr. Griffith? Mr. Griffith votes no. Mr. Carey? Mr. Carey votes no. Mr. Diaz-Fizito? Mr. Diaz-Fizito votes no. Ms. Lee? Ms. Lee votes no. Mr. Morelli?
Aye.
Mr. Morelli votes aye. Ms. Sewell? Ms. Sewell votes aye.
Does any member wish to change their vote? Does any member wish to change their vote? The clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, for this vote, there are 5 noes and 2 ayes.
The amendment is not agreed to. Does any other member seek recognition?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I have an amendment at the desk.
Gentleman has an amendment at the desk. The clerk will please distribute the amendment.
No. We're good. I'm good.
What's this amendment about? Is this the last one?
We have one more.
What about the next bill? Do we have amendments for that?
Thank you.
Staff told me there were no amendments.
Yeah, how many amendments do we have on the, just one of the same. Good.
The clerk will please report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R. 8399, offered by Mr. Morelli, page...
Without objection, further reading of the amendment will be dispensed with.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order.
The gentlewoman reserves a point of order for point of clarification. The previous point of order was waived. Unanimous consent? Thank you very much. Mr. Morelli is now recognized for 5 minutes in support of the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This amendment would add a prohibition to this bill to prevent foreign donors from promoting, supporting, attacking, or opposing the nomination of Senate confirmation of an individual who is under consideration for a federal judgeship. At a time when Americans are rightfully concerned about malign donor influence in the federal judiciary, including on the United States Supreme Court, this amendment will reassure Americans that foreign donors will not be able to influence our courts. Several high-profile investigations have, in recent months, revealed deeply concerning relationships between Supreme Court justices and Republican mega-donors. Indeed, whether it has been the brazen financial dealings between Clarence Thomas and billionaire Harlan Crow, or Justice Samuel Alito's astonishingly bad judgment in flying an upside-down American flag, a discredited symbol of extremism and election denialism, outside of his home in the days following the January 6th attack on this Capitol, the American people are in disbelief about the state of our judiciary. Just last night, public reporting confirmed that Justice Alito has been flying another flag associated with Donald Trump's attempt to steal the 2020 election, the Appeal to Heaven flag, outside of his vacation home. This was a flag that rioters carried as they stormed the United States Capitol on January 6th. Polls have shown that these ethical lapses have deeply hurt Americans' faith in the fairness of our judiciary. Americans should not have to worry that foreign donors, in addition to extremists and conservative activists, are influence peddling on our nation's highest court. This amendment should have bipartisan support. I urge my colleagues to vote yes, and I also ask unanimous consent to enter into the record this picture of the upside-down American flag, the symbol of Stop the Steal extremism, and the insurrectionist Appeal to Heaven flag, both of which flew outside the homes of Justice Samuel Alito. Thank you. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman, I object.
The gentleman objects on.
Gentleman asked for unanimous consent. If the amendment were to pass, it might make sense, but if the amendment doesn't pass, why would we insert into the record on this bill, your bill, something that is totally irrelevant to your bill, unless the amendment passes, in which case I would withdraw my objection.
Well, I would just strongly urge that the items I've asked to be entered into the record are germane to the amendment which is being considered in front of this House. I've never, in my 6 years here in Congress, ever heard anyone object to unanimous consent on filing something as part of the record.
All right, I withdraw my objection, but I think it's totally superfluous to the debate we're supposed to be having.
The gentleman withdraws his objection without objection entered into the record. Does the gentleman yield back?
Yes, sir.
Gentleman yields back. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes to strike the last word. I think there is grounds that we could definitely look in particular as it relates to the confirmation process in foreign money and foreign interference. Would love to work with my colleague on that. The underlying legislation we have before us is focused in on elections, and so I won't go through a germane process and remove the bill on germane. I'm happy to vote it up or down. But I think at its core, it's not germane in the sense of what we're trying to go after here in the underlying legislation, which is to remove foreign interference in U.S. elections. And so I think it's a worthy conversation to have. The gentleman brings up as it relates to Senate confirmations and any potential foreign interference in that space. I would enjoy having a dialogue and work with my colleague to find common ground in that space. It's just not the purpose of the underlying legislation, which is to address foreign interference in U.S. elections. Further, this amendment, as the previous amendment, strikes key donor privacy protections that I think are absolutely essential to maintain our First Amendment rights and to maintain the integrity of the broader electoral system. And so I encourage my colleagues to not support this bill, and I'll yield back. Does the gentlewoman from Florida seek recognition? For what purpose?
I do, Mr. Chairman, and just to note as follows, the discussion we're
Gentlewoman is
having...
recognized for 5 minutes to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That we're discussing at this time preventing foreign interference in elections, and I take exception to the comments directed at two of the justices of the United States Supreme Court, and would simply note that there is zero evidence to suggest that there is either an actual or even the appearance of any impropriety on the part of those justices or any influence on the part of foreign actors on those justices and their work at the Supreme Court. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. Does any other member seek recognition? Seeing none, does the gentlewoman from Florida insist on her point of order?
I do not, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
If no, the question's on the amendment by the gentleman from New York. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed signify by saying no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
I would ask for a recorded vote, Mr.
A
Chairman.
recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will please call the roll.
Chairman Stile?
No.
Chairman Stile votes no. Mr. Loudermilk? Mr. Griffith? Mr. Griffith votes no. Dr. Murphy? Mrs. Bice? Mr. Carey? Mr. Carey votes no. Mr. Diaz-Fazito? Mr. Diaz-Fazito votes no. Ms. Lee? Ms. Lee votes no. Mr. Morelli?
Aye.
Mr. Morelli votes aye. Ms. Sewell? Ms. Sewell votes aye. Mr. Kilmer? Mrs. Torres? Chairman Stile, for this vote, there are 2 ayes and 5 noes.
The motion, the amendment is not agreed to. Does any other member seek recognition?
Yes, Mr. Chair, I have one last amendment at the desk.
The gentleman has amendment at the desk. The clerk will please distribute the amendment. Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to H.R.
Without
8399.
objection, further reading of the amendment is dispensed with.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order.
The gentleman from Florida with a working microphone reserves a point of order. The gentleman from New York is recognized for 5 minutes in support of his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As I mentioned previously, I had hoped that we could keep working together on this bill because Democrats would like to prevent the spread of foreign money in our elections. But this bill as drafted would do the opposite. It would allow undisclosed foreign donations to inundate our politics. It would also prevent the FEC from investigating potential campaign finance violations, further weakening our ability to keep foreign money out of our politics. This amendment would strike the sections of the bill that would allow foreign donors to contribute undisclosed amounts to political campaigns, but would leave in place the prohibitions that I believe have bipartisan support, and I would like to see passed. So I urge my colleagues to support this amendment and allow us all to support the underlying bill. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I recognize myself for 5 minutes to strike the last word. The gentleman's amendment strikes key donor privacy protections. Again, as my comments on the previous 2 amendments, I maintain concerns about striking these essential donor privacy protections and would encourage my colleagues to vote no. I yield back. Does any other member seek recognition? Does the gentlewoman from Florida maintain her point of order?
No, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
There being no further debate on the amendment, the question is on the amendment by the gentleman from New York. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
I'd like to ask for a recorded vote.
A roll call vote is requested. The clerk will please call the roll.
Chairman Stile?
No.
Chairman Stile votes no. Mr. Loudermilk? Mr. Griffith? Mr. Griffith votes no. Dr. Murphy? Mrs. Bice? Mr. Carey? Mr. Carey votes no. Mr. D'Esposito? Mr. D'Esposito votes no. Ms. Lee? Ms. Lee votes no. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli votes aye. Ms. Sewell? Mr. Kilmer? Mrs. Torres? Mr. Chairman, for this vote, there is 1 aye and 5 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to. Does any other member seek recognition? If no, per our conversation on the side, to go back to the Ains, just for clarification, without objection, the amendment in the nature of substitute will be voted on. So the question now occurs on adopting the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the Ains is
And I would ask
is adopted.
for, recorded, Mr.
The
Chairman.
gentleman requests a recorded vote. The clerk will please call the roll.
Chairman Stile?
Yes.
Chairman Stile votes yes. Mr. Loudermilk? Mr. Griffith? Mr. Griffith votes yes. Dr. Murphy? Mrs. Bice? Mr. Carey? Mr. Carey votes yes. Mr. D'Esposito? Mr. D'Esposito votes yes. Ms. Lee? Ms. Lee votes yes. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli votes no. Ms. Sewell? Mr. Kilmer? Ms. Torres? Mr. Chairman, for this vote, there are 5 ayes and 1 no.
The amendment in the nature of substitute is agreed to. The question now occurs on ordering H.R. 8399 as amended, reported favorably to the House.
Chair, is a quorum present?
A quorum is present.
For the purposes of reporting the bill?
It would be whether or not the roll call has a sufficient number. And I know one of our members, not only one is just outside the room, and the other is maybe 5 feet further, who will be here in time for the roll call. So at the time of a quorum is present. The question I think that the gentleman might be asking is whether or not there's a sufficient number to report favorably to the House. I'm of the view that there will be a sufficient number. And so with that, the clerk will please call the roll.
Chairman Stile?
Aye.
Chairman Stile votes aye. Mr. Loudermilk? Mr. Griffith? Mr. Griffith votes aye. Dr. Murphy? Mrs. Bice? Mr. Carey? Mr. D'Esposito? Ms. Lee? Mr. Carey? Mr. Morelli? Ms.
Does-
Sewell? Mr. Kilmer? Mrs. Torres?
You need to walk.
Mrs. Bice?
Have all members voted? Does any member wish to change their vote? The clerk will please report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, for this vote, there are 6 ayes and 1 no.
The amendment, the, the amendment is agreed to and will be reported to the House floor favorably. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. I now call up H.R. 8281, the Safeguard American Voter Eligibility Act. Today, in our nation's capital, non-citizens are eligible to vote in municipal elections. Later today, we'll vote on the House floor to overturn D.C.'s non-citizen voting scheme. In this committee, we're working to ensure elections across the U.S. are for American citizens only, which this legislation will accomplish. This bill ensures non-citizens cannot vote in federal elections and provides states with the tools they need to maintain clean and accurate voter rolls. In our hearing last week, Mr. Hans von Spakovsky outlined a past example of non-citizens voting in federal elections in California's 46th House District in 1996. Congress studied whether or not non-citizens actually voted in the elections and found proof that non-citizens did, in fact, cast ballots. The margin of victory in that case was 1,000 votes. And the report found clear and convincing evidence that 624 documented aliens had registered and voted in the election. If the bill we are considering today had been law in 1996, this would not have happened. As we all know, it's not uncommon for the House to have close races. In 2020, our colleague Marinette Miller-Meeks won by just 6 votes. It's critical that we're preventing non-citizens from voting in upcoming elections. That's what we're here to do today. In Ohio, they recently found 137 non-citizens on their voter rolls. We want to ensure states have the tools they need to run secure elections. We want to ensure only American citizens are voting in U.S. elections. I look forward to a thoughtful discussion on this legislation. I'll recognize the ranking member, Mr. Morelli, if you'd like to give an opening statement on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My colleagues like to say their goal on the Republican side is to make it easy to vote, hard to cheat. I agree with that goal. That's why I'm going to continue to support advancing legislation like the Freedom to Vote Act that would do just that. During our hearing last week on this measure, in my opening remarks, I expressed my sincere concern with the SAVE Act. This bill is unreasonably restrictive. The bill would create extreme documentary requirements nationwide, making it much, much, much harder to vote, burdening every potential voter, and particularly affecting people who have difficulty obtaining the required documents, including married women who have changed their names, students on a college campus, the elderly, lower-income people, members of tribal nations, naturalized citizens, and yes, even Republicans. I don't know if my Republican colleagues even realize how restrictive this is. Most Americans would be unable to register to vote with just their driver's license, which is the way I did it when I registered to vote many, many years ago. How many Americans are prepared to bring their birth certificates to the election office just to cast a rightful ballot, or bring their passports? How many members of our armed forces are prepared to bring their military service records with place of birth identified? Not only are the bill's requirements extreme, the SAVE Act would impose severe criminal penalties on election administrators for simple good faith mistakes. We know this bill is not a serious legislative exercise. It's a vehicle to undermine American confidence in elections. But if we're ever to become law, its provisions are so draconian that it would surely disenfranchise millions of eligible Americans. This bill is a solution in search of a problem. The law is already clear. It is unlawful for non-citizens to register to vote. It's unlawful for a felony for individuals who are not U.S. citizens to vote in federal elections. Worse yet, the bill is the latest step by House Republicans to preemptively cover Donald Trump's lies, both past and future. Here we thought the Republicans were only focused on restricting women's private personal health care decisions. They continue to support Donald Trump, a man who appointed the Supreme Court majority that destroyed women's right to choose. Just yesterday, former President Trump indicated he would restrict women's access to contraception. So just as Republicans seek to restrict women's access to abortion, they now want to seek and restrict Americans' access to the ballot. This is a deeply undemocratic bill. It is indicative of a cynical outlook the Republican Party has on American democracy and the contempt with which they hold American voters. With that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The clerk will please report the bill.
HR
Without
8281.
objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with. Also without objection, the bill may be considered as read and open to amendment at any point. I have an amendment in the nature of the substitute of the desk. The clerk will please report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to HR.
Without
8281.
objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute is considered as read and will be considered as original text for purposes of further amendment. Does any member wish to seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk, sir.
The gentleman from New York has an amendment at the desk. The clerk will please distribute. The clerk will please report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to
Without
HR.
objection, further reading of the amendment is dispensed with. Does the gentlewoman from Florida seek a point of order?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I reserve a point of order.
The gentlewoman from Florida reserves a point of order. The gentleman from New York is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have explained repeatedly how damaging I believe the underlying bill before the committee will be, and how damaging the conspiracy theories that Republicans use that underpin the legislation and continue to repeat. It's important for the American people to understand the divergent paths the two parties are offering, because you could not have more opposing views of American democracy. The Republican SAVE Act, cloaked in lies about non-existent, non-citizen voting, would disenfranchise millions of eligible American voters. The bill would prevent Americans from voting simply because they do not have or cannot afford or do not need a passport or do not have access to their birth certificate or have trouble overcoming the various other documentary hurdles this bill seeks to impose. In place of this odious bill, Democrats offer in his amendment the relevant portions of the Freedom to Vote Act, the most pro-democracy legislation since the Voting Rights Act of 1965. For my colleagues on the other side, we figured we'd save you some work. We've had the Legislative Counsel's Office scrub the amendment of all the Freedom to Vote Act provisions that are not germane to the underlying bill. So we thought we'd save you some homework. Where the SAVE Act would block American access to the ballot, the FTVA would expand automatic voter registration and same-day registration. Where the SAVE Act would create massive hurdles, the Freedom to Vote Act will set a national standard for no excuse vote by mail for every eligible voter, as it's done in many, many states across this country and has been done without complaint and without objection for decades. Where the SAVE Act would prevent millions of Americans from registering to vote at all, the Freedom to Vote Act will protect the integrity of our voter registration list by prohibiting unlawful and faulty voter purges. The SAFE Act will make it harder to vote. The Freedom to Vote Act will expand early voting by requiring states to offer early voting at least 2 weeks prior to Election Day. The SAVE Act does nothing to ease access to the ballot for people who may need additional assistance. The Freedom to Vote Act will protect access to the ballot for individuals with different physical abilities. Unlike the SAVE Act, the Freedom to Vote Act will make Election Day a national holiday. The SAVE Act does nothing to root out real, proven foreign interference in politics. The Freedom to Vote Act will prevent enemies, foreign and domestic, from subverting the will of voters by restricting the politicized removal of election officials and cracking down on foreign influence in our politics. The SAVE Act does nothing to address the crisis of intimidation against election workers. The Freedom to Vote Act will crack down on the violence and threats against election workers and officials who remain in constant danger since the former president and his allies targeted several public servants with threats and harassment. The SAVE Act ignores the power of special interest donors over our political system. The Freedom to Vote Act will end the flood of dark money in American elections, amplifying the voices of everyday Americans and shifting power away from the Republican-aligned billionaires and corporate interests that spend endless money on our political campaigns. What do my colleagues on the other side of the aisle offer in this bill? Lies meant to undermine American confidence in elections. American democracy is in peril. Only the Freedom to Vote Act will defend our republic against those who actively seek to undermine our election integrity. For the sake of our democracy, for the sake of our republic, I urge my colleagues to support this amendment. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. I recognize myself for 5 minutes to strike the last word. I'm not sure if in incredible speed my colleague struck the non-germane aspects following my comments on the germaneness of a previous amendment at this markup, but I do appreciate the effort to strike out the non-germane aspects of your so-called Freedom to Vote Act, which really stands in contrast to the underlying legislation that we're doing. We're working to increase the integrity of our elections, block non-citizens from voting in our elections. Your bill is pushed by Democrats time and again, really does the opposite. And so I would encourage my colleagues to vote no on this. It strikes the core concept of our legislation, which is to prevent non-citizens from voting, increasing and enhancing the integrity in our elections. The legislation, the amendment put before us, moves us in the opposite direction, decreasing Americans' confidence in our elections. And we've seen time and again as we took this committee to Georgia introducing the ACE Act, and we explored in particular Georgia's election integrity legislation, exactly the opposite of what President Biden claimed would occur. And many of those in the media and those on the left who went hook, line, and sinker along with the president's misleading and false statements said, well, we actually looked when we explored the empirical data is actually people participated in record numbers in Georgia, and people were actually across the board pleased with the elections, which is a good thing. When we saw the University of Georgia study set forth that following the Georgia election, following the Georgia election integrity law being passed, overwhelming support, including all key demographic groups, in particular blacks in Georgia, had overwhelming support for the legislation. That's a positive thing. And what we saw was significant voter participation in Georgia. Again, a very positive thing. And so I think what we see at its core is when we pass good, solid voter integrity legislation, Americans have more confidence in the elections, participate, and we have stronger elections. I think this amendment goes in the opposite direction. It strikes the core provisions of our legislation, but not only that, it actually weakens voter integrity provisions that are essential for states to be building confidence in our elections to garner more people to participate. And so I encourage my colleagues to oppose this amendment, and I yield back. Is there any further debate on the amendment? If no, the question, does the gentlewoman from Florida maintain her point of order?
No, Mr. Chairman, I will waive it and yield back.
The gentleman waives her point of order. The question is now on the amendment by the gentleman from New York. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
All those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to. The gentleman requests a recorded vote. The clerk will please call the roll.
Chairman Stile?
No.
Chairman Stile votes no. Mr. Loudermilk? Mr. Griffith? Mr. Griffith votes no. Dr. Murphy? Mrs. Bice? Mrs. Bice votes no. Mr. Carey? Mr. Carey votes no. Mr. Diaz-Fazito? Mr. Diaz-Fazito votes no. Ms. Lee? Ms. Lee votes no. Mr. Morelli?
Aye.
Mr. Morelli votes aye. Ms. Sewell? Mr. Kilmer? Mrs. Torres?
Have all members voted? Does any member wish to change their vote? The clerk will please report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, for this vote, there's 1 aye and 6 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to. Does any member wish to seek recognition? Ms. Lee of Florida.
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The gentleman has an amendment at the desk. The clerk will please.
I reserve point of order.
The gentleman from New York reserves a point of order. The clerk will please report and distribute the clerk will please distribute the amendment. The clerk will please report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Ms. Lee
Without
to the
objection,
amendment.
for the reading, the amendment is dispensed with. The gentlewoman from Florida is recognized for 5 minutes in support of the amendment.
Mr. Chairman, our committee members and staff have been hard at work making improvements to further strengthen the SAVE Act. My amendment to your ANS makes a few technical and conforming changes that the bill sponsor has presented.
The gentlewoman yields back. Is there further debate on the amendment?
Sorry, Mr. Chair,
Would the gentleman like to seek recognition to strike the last word?
I would like to seek recognition to strike the last word.
Gentleman is
Thank you.
recognized for 5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you. I only obviously had just a few seconds to look at it, but I fear that nothing in this bill, in my mind, can make it any better, so I would urge defeat of the amendment, defeat of the underlying bill. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Is there further debate on the bill? Seeing none, does the gentleman maintain his point of order?
No.
The gentleman removes his point of order. If there's no further debate on the bill, the question is now on the amendment from Ms. Lee of Florida. All those in favor signify by saying aye. All those opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The gentleman from New York requests a recorded vote. The clerk will please call the roll.
Chairman Stile?
Aye.
Chairman Stile votes aye. Mr. Loudermilk? Mr. Griffith? Mr. Griffith votes aye. Dr. Murphy? Mrs. Bice? Mrs. Bice votes aye. Mr. Carey? Mr. Carey votes aye. Mr. Diaz-Pozito? Mr. Diaz-Pozito votes aye. Ms. Lee? Ms. Lee votes aye. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli votes no. Ms. Sewell? Mr. Kilmer? Mrs. Torres? Mr. Chairman, for this vote, there are 6 ayes and 1 no.
The amendment is agreed to. Does any other member seek recognition? If not, the question now occurs on adopting the amendment in the nature of a substitute as amended. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the ayes is agreed to. The gentleman requests a recorded vote. The clerk will please call the roll.
Chairman Stile?
Aye.
Chairman Stile votes aye. Mr. Loudermilk? Mr. Griffith? Mr. Griffith votes aye. Dr. Murphy? Mrs. Bice? Mrs. Bice votes aye. Mr. Carey? Mr. Carey votes aye. Mr. Diaz-Pozito? Mr. Diaz-Pozito votes aye. Ms. Lee? Ms. Lee votes aye. Mr. Morelli?
No.
Mr. Morelli votes no. Ms. Sewell? Mr. Kilmer? Mrs. Torres?
Does any member wish to change their vote? Have all members voted? The clerk will please report the roll.
Mr. Chairman, for this vote, there are 6 ayes and 1 no.
The amendment in the nature of a substitute as amended is agreed to. The question now occurs on ordering H.R. 8281 as amended, reported favorably to the House. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. All those opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion to report is agreed to. The gentleman requests a recorded vote. A recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will please call the roll.
Chairman Stile?
Aye.
Chairman Stile votes aye. Mr. Loudermilk? Mr. Griffith? Mr. Griffith votes aye. Dr. Murphy? Mrs. Bice? Mrs. Bice votes aye. Mr. Carey? Mr. Carey votes aye. Mr. Diaz-Fazito? Mr. Diaz-Fazito votes aye. Ms. Lee? Ms. Lee votes aye. Mr. Morelli? Mr. Morelli votes no. Ms. Sewell? Mr. Kilmer? Mrs. Torres?
Have all members voted? Does any member wish to change their vote? The clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, for this vote, there are 6 ayes and 1 no.
The bill is, the amendment in the nature of substitute is reported to the House floor favorably. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. This concludes the order of business for today's markup pursuant to House Rule 9, Clause 2L. I ask that committee members have the right to file with the clerk of the committee supplemental, additional, minority, and dissenting views on each of the items marked up today without objection. Also, without objection, the staff is authorized to make necessary technical and conforming changes. If there's no other business, I thank the members for their participation. Without objection, the Committee on House Administration stands adjourned.